You used to be the most driven person in the room. You had goals, systems, 5-year plans. You woke up early. You ground through obstacles. You outworked everyone around you and felt a kind of savage satisfaction in the effort. Then, something shifted. Not overnight, but steadily, like a tide pulling out so slowly you didn't notice the water was gone until you were standing on dry sand. The ambition just left. The goals that used to electrify you started feeling like someone else's homework. The career you built with your bare hands started feeling like a costume you couldn't remember putting on. And the worst part isn't the loss of motivation itself. The worst part is that you can't explain it. You're not depressed in the way people understand depression. You're not burned out in the way productivity culture talks about burnout. You don't need a vacation or a new planner or a motivational podcast. Something structural has changed inside you, something foundational, and no one around you understands what's happening because from the outside, it just looks like you've given up. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact phenomenon. He saw it again and again in patients who were undergoing what he called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. And what he discovered about this collapse of motivation was so counterintuitive that it contradicts nearly everything modern culture teaches about drive, purpose, and success. Jung found that when spiritual awakening destroys your motivation, it's not breaking you. It's dismantling a machine that was never actually yours to begin with. And the emptiness it leaves behind isn't failure. It's the first honest space you've occupied in your entire adult life. Today, I'm going to show you why spiritual awakening systematically destroys motivation. What Jung discovered is actually dying inside you when the drive disappears. Why the void that follows isn't depression, even though it feels identical. And what emerges on the other side that operates on a completely different fuel source than anything you've experienced before. Because if you're in that place right now where you can't make yourself care about the things that used to define you, Jung would tell you that you're not losing yourself. You're losing the version of yourself that was built to survive, not to live. And that loss, as devastating as it feels, is the prerequisite for everything real. To understand why awakening kills motivation, you first have to understand where your motivation came from. Not the story you tell about it, not the inspirational version where you're just naturally ambitious or passionate or driven, the actual psychological origin. Because Jung discovered that in the vast majority of people, motivation doesn't come from passion or purpose, it comes from wounds. Think about someone who spent their entire life achieving, top of their class, first one hired, fastest promoted, always producing, always performing, always exceeding expectations. From the outside, this looks like success. From the inside, if you examined it honestly, you'd find something very different driving it. You'd find a child who learned that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned, that their value as a human being was directly tied to what they produced, what they accomplished, what they could prove. That child didn't grow up and become ambitious. That child grew up and became desperate. The ambition was a survival mechanism. The drive was terror wearing a productive mask. Every achievement was an attempt to answer a question that was never actually about career or success. The real question underneath every goal was simpler and more devastating. Am I enough? Am I worthy of love? Do I deserve to exist if I'm not performing? Jung called this compensatory motivation. The psyche builds an elaborate motivational structure, not because it's pursuing genuine desire, but because it's compensating for a core wound. The wound says you're worthless. The compensation says you'll prove you're not by achieving so relentlessly that the worthlessness can never catch up. And this creates people who look incredibly successful while being internally driven by the same terror that drove them as children. This is the motivation that spiritual awakening destroys. Not genuine passion, not authentic calling, not the quiet pull toward meaningful work. Awakening targets the compensatory structure specifically because that structure is built on a lie. The lie that you have to earn your right to exist. The lie that your value comes from output. The lie that if you stop performing, you'll be abandoned, rejected, proven worthless. When consciousness begins expanding, when the persona starts cracking, when you begin seeing yourself and your life with genuine clarity, the compensatory motivation loses its power, because you start recognizing the wound underneath. You start seeing that the drive wasn't passion, it was panic. The ambition wasn't aspiration, it was avoidance. Every goal you pursued with such ferocity was actually a running away from something rather than a moving towards something. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The engine doesn't just stall, it becomes something you can't bring yourself to restart, because now you know what fuel it runs on. Jung observed that this recognition usually happens gradually. A patient would come in confused about why their career no longer felt meaningful, why the promotion they worked toward for years felt hollow the moment they got it, why the business they built from nothing now felt like a prison they'd constructed around themselves. They'd describe this experience with genuine bewilderment, because nothing external had changed. The job was the same, the opportunities were the same, but the internal experience had shifted so profoundly that what used to generate energy now drained it completely. What Jung identified was that the persona, the constructed identity you show the world, runs on specific fuel. External validation, social approval, the feeling of being needed, admired, respected. Achievement provides this fuel reliably. You accomplish something, people praise you, the persona gets fed, and you feel temporarily okay about yourself. Then the feeling fades, and you need to accomplish something else. It's a cycle that looks like productivity, but functions like addiction. Spiritual awakening disrupts the fuel supply. When you begin waking up, you start seeing through the validation cycle. You notice that the praise doesn't actually touch the wound, that the achievement doesn't resolve the core question, that you've been feeding a structure that can never be satisfied because it's not designed to be satisfied. It's designed to keep you performing. And this recognition doesn't make you feel enlightened. It makes you feel gutted. Because now the thing that organized your entire life, that gave you identity and purpose and a reason to get up in the morning, has been revealed as a sophisticated avoidance mechanism, and you can't go back to believing in it. This is where the void begins, the space between losing compensatory motivation and finding something authentic to replace it. And this void is one of the most terrifying experiences in the entire awakening process, because you suddenly have nothing driving you forward. The goals are gone, the ambition is gone, the need to prove yourself has been seen through and can no longer generate the frantic energy it used to produce. You're left standing in absolute stillness, with no idea what to do next, because every previous movement was generated by a machine that's now been decommissioned. Jung described this as the fallow period, like a field that's been stripped of its crops and left bare to recover. Nothing is growing, nothing is producing, the ground looks dead, and everyone walking by assumes the field is ruined, that it'll never produce again, that something has gone terribly wrong. But the fallow period isn't death. It's the soil recovering from being overworked. It's the ground remembering its own composition rather than being defined by what was planted in it. The fallow period of awakening looks almost identical to depression from the outside. You withdraw. You lose interest in things. You sleep more. You struggle with basic tasks. You can't perform socially the way you used to. People around you get concerned. They suggest therapy, medication, lifestyle changes. They treat it like something is wrong with you, because in their framework, losing motivation is always pathological. But Jung was insistent that the fallow period isn't depression, even though it borrows depression's entire wardrobe. Depression is a collapse that leads nowhere, a sinking without purpose. The fallow period is a deliberate dismantling conducted by the psyche itself to clear space for something the compensatory structure was blocking. Depression feels like you're falling into darkness. The fallow period feels like darkness is dissolving everything that isn't real. Both are painful, but one leads deeper into unconsciousness, while the other leads through temporary darkness toward genuine consciousness. The distinction matters because how you respond to this period determines whether the awakening completes itself or gets aborted. If you treat the fallow period as depression, if you panic and try to rebuild the old motivation through sheer willpower, if you force yourself back into the performance, you can actually shut down the awakening process. You can reconstruct the compensatory structure, restart the achievement cycle, and push the emerging consciousness back underground. And you'll function again. You'll look normal again, but but you'll have betrayed something essential that was trying to be born, and you'll know it. You'll feel the loss of what almost happened for the rest of your life. Jung found that the fallow period required something most people aren't prepared to give: patience without understanding. You have to sit in the void without knowing what's coming, without a plan, without a timeline, without any guarantee that something will emerge on the other side. You have to tolerate the terrifying absence of direction in a culture that treats directionlessness as moral failure. And if you've been sitting in that stillness, unsure whether what's happening inside you is breakdown or breakthrough, wondering if the drive will ever return, or if you've permanently lost something essential, this is the kind of inner work that Jung spent his life mapping. Not the surface work of productivity or goal setting, but the deeper excavation of understanding what was actually driving you and what wants to emerge when the false drivers are stripped away. If you're looking for a way to navigate that excavation, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed not to rebuild the old motivation, but to help you hear what's trying to speak in the silence. You'll find it linked below. And what comes next in this process is something Jung considered one of the most important psychological transitions a human being can undergo. Because something does emerge. Not on your timeline, not in the form you expect. But Jung documented it consistently across patients who survived the fallow period without aborting the process. A completely different motivational system begins activating, and it operates on principles so fundamentally different from compensatory motivation that most people don't even recognize it as motivation when it first appears. Compensatory motivation is loud, it's urgent, it wakes you up at 5 in the morning with racing thoughts about what you need to accomplish. It generates anxiety when you're not producing. It creates a constant internal pressure that feels like drive, but is actually fear. You always know what compensatory motivation wants because it shouts. What replaces it is quiet, almost silent at first. Jung described it as motivation arising from the self rather than the ego. The self, in Jung's framework, is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the organizing center of who you actually are rather than who you've constructed yourself to be. And the self doesn't motivate through panic, it motivates through pull. The difference between push and pull motivation is the difference between running from something and being drawn toward something. Compensatory motivation pushes. You achieve because you're terrified of what happens if you don't. Self-motivated action pulls. You move towards something because it resonates with who you actually are at a level deeper than persona, deeper than social identity, deeper than anything the wound ever constructed. Jung found that patients emerging from the fallow period described this new motivation in remarkably similar terms. They'd say things like, "I don't feel driven anymore, but I feel clear," or "I'm not ambitious, but I know exactly what I need to do," or "It doesn't feel urgent, but it feels more real than anything I've ever pursued." The frantic quality was gone. The desperate energy had dissolved. What replaced it was a quiet certainty that didn't need external validation to sustain itself. This confused people around them because the external output often looked smaller. Someone who'd been climbing corporate ladders might shift to work that paid less, but aligned with something genuine. Someone who'd been producing constantly might slow down and create fewer things but with a quality and authenticity they'd never accessed before. Someone who'd been performing for audiences might withdraw from public life to do something quiet and essential that nobody saw. From the outside, this looked like giving up, like the person had lost their edge, like they'd gone soft or gotten lazy or lost the competitive fire. But from the inside, the experience was the opposite. They hadn't lost motivation, they'd lost false motivation, and what remained was something the compensatory structure had been drowning out their entire lives. Jung called this the discovery of vocation in the original sense of the word, from the Latin vocare, meaning to call. Not career, not profession, not what you do to earn money or status or approval. Calling, the thing that speaks to you from a place so deep it precedes any wound, any conditioning, any social programming. The thing you do even if no one watched, no one praised, no one paid you. the thing that isn't about proving anything to anyone because it exists independently of the wound's demands. Most people never hear this calling because compensatory motivation is too loud. The fear-driven achievement system generates so much noise, so much urgency, so much frantic activity that the quiet voice of genuine vocation can't penetrate. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a factory. The machinery drowns out everything subtle. And this is why awakening has to destroy the machinery first, not to leave you empty forever, but to create enough silence for the whisper to finally be heard. Jung observed something else about this transition that most people find counterintuitive. The things you're drawn toward after the fallow period often have nothing to do with your previous achievements. The skills you developed might still be relevant, but the direction shifts entirely. Someone who built a career in finance might discover they're called to teach. Someone who spent decades in corporate leadership might feel drawn to work with their hands. Someone who performed professionally might discover that their vocation is private, something that happens in solitude rather than on stages. This isn't regression, it's realignment. The compensatory structure chose directions based on what would best address the wound. What generates the most validation? What proves worthiness most efficiently? What earns the most approval with the least vulnerability? These questions drove career choices, relationship choices, life architecture choices, and they built a life that looked impressive while feeling hollow. When the self takes over navigation, the questions change entirely. What is actually mine? What resonates with who I am rather than who I was performing? What would I pursue if the wound's demands were completely silent? These questions lead to very different answers. Answers that often surprise the person having them because they'd never allowed themselves to ask from this place before. Jung warned that this transition terrifies the ego, because the ego's identity was built on the compensatory structure. I'm the achiever. I'm the successful one. I'm the person who gets things done. When that motivation dissolves, the ego experiences it as annihilation, not just losing motivation, but losing identity. You don't know who you are without the drive, because the drive was who you were, or who you thought you were. And sitting in the gap between that dissolved identity and whatever's forming underneath requires tolerating a level of uncertainty that most egos will do anything to avoid. This is why so many people abort the process. They can't tolerate the identity loss. They panic, rebuild the old structure, return to the achievement cycle, and tell themselves they went through a rough patch but they're back on track now. And they are back on track, just the wrong track. The track built by the wound rather than the one being revealed by the self. And they'll spend the rest of their lives on that track, producing and achieving and performing, while something inside them remembers the moment they almost became real and chose safety instead. Jung didn't judge these people. He understood that the fallow period asks more of a person than most can give. But he also documented what happened to those who endured it. And what he found was that the people who survived the dissolution of compensatory motivation didn't become less effective. They became differently effective. Their output wasn't driven by fear anymore, which meant it wasn't contaminated by desperation. Their work wasn't compensating for a wound, which meant it carried a different quality, something authentic that people could sense even if they couldn't name it. These people stopped chasing and started creating. There's a profound difference between the two. Chasing is moving towards something you believe will complete you. Creating is expressing something that's already complete within you. Chasing is desperate. Creating is generous. Chasing depletes because it's fueled by lack. Creating sustains because it's fueled by overflow. And this shift from chasing to creating only becomes possible when the compensatory structure dies and the self's motivation takes its place. Jung also found that people operating from self-motivation had a fundamentally different relationship with results. Compensatory motivation is obsessed with outcomes because the outcome is the payoff. You achieve the thing, you get the validation, the wound gets temporarily soothed. Without that payoff, the entire enterprise feels pointless. But self-motivation isn't about outcomes, it's about alignment. You do the work because the work is yours to do, not because of what the work will get you. And paradoxically, this often produces better results because the work isn't contaminated by the desperate energy that compensatory motivation injects into everything. Think about the difference between a musician performing to prove they're talented and a musician playing because the music moves through them and they're simply following it. The audience can feel that difference even if they can't articulate it. One performance is seeking something from the audience, the other is giving something to them. And the one that gives is almost always more powerful, more resonant, more lasting. This is what becomes possible on the other side of motivation's death. Not the absence of movement, the presence of movement that's actually yours. Not the paralysis of permanent apathy, the discovery of a direction that doesn't require fear to fuel it. Not becoming less than you were, becoming more accurately who you are. But Jung was honest about the costs. People operating from self-motivation often produce things that are less commercially viable, less socially impressive, less immediately recognizable as success. Because the self doesn't care about marketability or status, it cares about truth. And truth doesn't always sell well. Truth doesn't always look impressive at dinner parties. Truth doesn't always generate the kind of results that make your parents proud or your peers envious. This means choosing self-motivation often means choosing to be misunderstood, choosing to appear less successful than you could be, choosing depth over breadth, authenticity over impressiveness, alignment over achievement. And in a culture that measures human worth by productivity and visible success, this choice can feel like social suicide. Jung acknowledged that this was the price of individuation. Becoming who you actually are costs you the approval of everyone who loved who you were pretending to be. And this loss compounds the difficulty of the fallow period because you're not just losing motivation, you're losing the social identity that motivation built, the respect that achievement earned, the relationships that were based on your performance rather than your person. But here's what Jung found in patient after patient who made it through. The life that forms on the other side of this loss is qualitatively different from anything the compensatory structure could build. It's smaller in some ways, quieter, less externally validated, but it's real. Every piece of it is chosen rather than compelled. Every relationship in it is based on who you actually are rather than who you were performing. Every pursuit in it is genuinely yours rather than the wound's desperate reaching for proof of worthiness. The motivation that sustains this life doesn't fluctuate the way compensatory motivation does. Compensatory motivation requires constant feeding, achievement, validation, approval, recognition. Miss a feeding and the motivation collapses, the despair rushes in, the wound screams that you're worthless. It's an unstable system that requires constant maintenance. Self-motivation is stable because it's not dependent on external input. It arises from alignment rather than compensation. It doesn't need to be fed because it's not addressing a deficit. It's expressing a fullness. Jung described this as the difference between a fire that requires constant fuel and a fire that burns from an internal source. Compensatory motivation is like burning furniture to stay warm. You're consuming your own life to maintain the flame. Eventually you run out of things to burn. Self-motivation is like geothermal heat. It comes from so deep inside the earth that it doesn't deplete. It's always there. It doesn't depend on what you feed it. It exists because of what you are, not what you do. If you're in the fallow period right now, if you're standing in that bewildering space where the old motivation has died and nothing has replaced it yet, Jung would tell you 3 things. First, you're not broken. The machine that broke was never actually you. It was a survival mechanism that outlived its usefulness and is being cleared to make room for something that doesn't need survival as its fuel source. Second, don't rebuild. The temptation to reconstruct the old motivational system will be enormous because the void is terrifying and the old system at least gave you direction, even if that direction was ultimately a circle. Resist the reconstruction. Let the field lie fallow. Let the soil recover. What grows from recovered ground will be entirely different from what was planted in exhausted soil. Third, listen for the quiet. The self's motivation doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It appears as a subtle pull rather than a forceful push. It shows up as something that interests you for no productive reason. Something you find yourself thinking about without trying. Something that engages you without promising any payoff. That whisper is the beginning. and it will grow louder only if you protect the silence that allows you to hear it. This is why awakening destroys motivation, not because awakening is destructive, because the motivation it destroys was built on a lie, and awakening cannot coexist with lies. The lie that you have to earn your existence, the lie that your worth comes from output, the lie that without constant achievement, you're nothing. Awakening dissolves these lies, and when they go, they take the entire motivational architecture with them. What remains after the dissolution isn't nothing. It's the first honest ground you've ever stood on, ground that isn't asking you to perform, ground that doesn't require achievements to justify your presence on it, ground that's simply there, solid and real, waiting for you to build something on it that you actually want to build, rather than something you were building because you were terrified of what would happen if you stopped. Jung spent his life watching people cross this threshold, watching them lose everything the wound built and discover what the self wanted to create, watching them go from driven to called, from performing to expressing, from compensating to simply being. And he maintained until the end of his life that this crossing, as devastating as it feels while you're in it, is the single most important psychological transition a human being can make. Not because what comes after is easy, but because what comes after is real. And most people live their entire lives without ever touching anything real because the machinery of compensation is too loud for them to hear what's underneath. Your motivation didn't die. Your wound's motivation died. And in the silence it left behind, something that's been waiting your entire life is finally being given permission to speak. The only question is whether you'll stay in the silence long enough to hear it, or whether you'll fill the void with noise because the silence is more than you can bear. Jung believed most people would choose the noise, but some, the ones who couldn't go back to pretending, the ones for whom the lie had become more painful than the void, would sit in that terrible quiet and wait. And those people would eventually hear something so unmistakably theirs that no wound, no conditioning, no social pressure could drown it out again. That's what comes after motivation dies, not emptiness, recognition. The slow, quiet, irreversible recognition of who you've been all along, underneath everything you were performing. And that recognition doesn't push you forward. It simply shows you where you already belong. Then you move toward it, not because you're driven, because you're home. At some point today, find 10 minutes where you're not producing anything, not consuming anything, not performing for anyone, and let one question exist in that space without demanding an answer from it. If you had nothing left to prove, what would you still want to do? You don't need to act on whatever surfaces. You don't even need it to make sense. What matters is that you're giving the silence a chance to speak. The same silence the compensatory machine spent years drowning out. And if nothing comes, that's not failure. That's the fallow ground doing what fallow ground does. You're not looking for your next goal. You're listening for the whisper that was always underneath the noise, the one that doesn't need to justify itself, doesn't need to impress anyone, doesn't need to earn its right to exist. Just notice what's there when everything else is finally quiet. If you've been standing in that silence, wondering whether something real is trying to surface beneath everything the old ambition buried, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was created for exactly this crossing. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, each one designed to help you hear what speaks when the noise finally stops. Click below to find your way within.